Chapter 31 Low Tide. The black, opaque water suddenly surged and seethed, as though a living creature desperately trying to avoid the pale light of the coming dawn. Sunny slowly rose and, after some thought, carefully approached the edge of the stone platform. Looking down, he blinked and then kneeled to make sure that what he saw wasn't an illusion. The sea seemed to be receding. Slowly at first, and then faster and faster, the water level was dropping. The circular stone formation he had been taking shelter on used to barely protrude out of the waves, but now there were meters and meters of wet rock between him and the restless surface of the sea. As the sun climbed up, the monstrous ebb tide continued. Soon, Sunny found himself standing on the edge of a tall cliff, with 100-meter drop separating him from the churning waters. Beneath him, the rock formation broadened and changed shape. However, from his vantage point, it was hard to determine what that shape was, exactly. At that time, the dark surface of the water began to be punctured here and there by sharp crimson blades. As it dropped even further, it was as though a crimson forest was slowly rising from the black depths. The trees were made of something resembling coral, growing chaotically into each other and stretching toward the sky. They were colossal in size, with irregular protrusions entwining and merging together, looking monumental and eerie in the black and red reality of the sunlit void. The labyrinth formed by this strange reef stretched as far as Sunny could see, broken here and there by protruding cliffs, sudden chasms, and distant natural features. Half an hour later, utterly shocked, Sunny stared down and realized that the sea was completely gone. If not for the black seaweed left hanging on wet rocks and scarlet pillars of coral, he would even doubt if it was ever there. His small circular island had turned into the peak of a strange, towering, irregularly shaped cliff. Looking down, he felt his head spinning. By then, the night had already fully retreated, letting morning finally take its place. "I'm not seeing things, am I?" Sunny thought, pinching himself. What the spell was that? Despite the sudden disappearance of the dark sea and its hidden monsters, Sunny was in no rush to climb down from his circular stone platform. Firstly, he felt that if the sea was able to disappear, it was surely able to come back, perhaps at any moment. Secondly, he did not know what dangers the coral labyrinth was hiding. Perhaps there was something even scarier than the owner of the giant tentacle down there. But that did not mean that he wasn't going to explore. Coming back to his spot in the middle of the platform, Sunny sat down and commanded his shadow to separate itself from his body. Then, taking control of it, he approached the edge of the platform and nimbly slid down. Habitually moving from one shadow to another, he began the descent. At this moment, Sunny was glad that shadows had no weight and were not affected by gravity. While the shadow was busy climbing down, Sunny yawned. "Say, don't you think that you need a name?" Although his shadow was already too far away to hear him, they still could communicate through their shared connection. Of course, the fact that it could did not mean that it would. The shadow was sort of taciturn, mostly because it didn't have vocal cords and was unable to speak. Plus, its temper wasn't that great. How about shameless? No? What about shady? Also no? What about something simpler like what? Well, do you have suggestions then? All right. We'll shelve this conversation for later. By the time he was done with this short monologue, the shadow had already reached the bottom of the cliff. The range of shadow control was not limitless, but it was just barely enough to explore their nearest surroundings. Entering the labyrinth, Sunny found it to be extremely disorienting and convoluted. The paths between coral pillars were sometimes broad, sometimes narrow. They twisted and turned without any logic, often leading to dead ends or even back to where he started. More than that, some paths entered inside the coral mounds, turning into dark tunnels. The labyrinth was vast and multi-layered, making Sunny's head hurt after multiple fruitless attempts to memorize the layout of the nearest pathways. In the end, he sent the shadow up, forcing it to climb on top of the crimson forest, and start jumping from one sharp coral blade to another, knowing full well that he himself would not be able to do the same. Soon, he circled the strange cliff and froze, scared by the sight of what was happening in its shadow. There, the corpse of the giant shark-like creature that had briefly pursued him the previous night was laying on the ground, the pillars of coral around it shattered and broken. More precisely, half of it was there, with grotesque innards spilling out of the terrible wound and stretching far away into the distance. The other half was gone, as though it had never existed. Around the corpse, hundreds of smaller monsters were scurrying, tearing away and devouring its flesh bit by bit. Each of them was about 2.5 meters tall, looking like a weird mix of a demonic crab, a centaur, and a nightmare. They had 4 pairs of long, segmented legs that ended in scythe-like protrusions. At the front, a human-like torso was protruding from the carapace, also clad in thick chitinous armor. The head, if it was even the appropriate word, was situated directly on top of the torso, with no neck in between. It had 2 narrow eye slits and a viscous-looking mouth with several slimy mandibles. Instead of hands, the monsters had 2 enormous pincers. Currently, they were all using those pincers to tear off chunks of meat off the desiccated corpse and stuff them into their mouths. From time to time, a fight for an especially juicy piece of meat would break out, ending up in a few monsters being torn apart and quickly devoured by the victors. Sunny swallowed. Both because the sight of heavily armored, powerful monsters made him nervous and because looking at them feasting, he suddenly felt very hungry. Each of them seems like trouble. And there are hundreds of them. His luck, like always, was awful. At least I don't have to wonder why the labyrinth feels so empty. All the inhabitants are having a party. Feeling a little bit comprehensive about turning his shadows back to the monsters, Sunny commanded it to look back and study the cliff he was taking shelter atop of. Something about it was making him feel uneasy. The shadow turned around and looked up, taking in the sight of the strangely shaped cliff. It took Sunny a few minutes to shift his perspective and recognize it for what it was. That's a finger. That's a hand. That is a sword? He blinked. It's a statue. Indeed, the cliff was man-made. It was an ancient, colossal statue at least 200 meters tall. The scale of it was so massive that it boggled the mind. From what Sunny could see, it depicted a knight clad in an elaborate plate armor, with 7 shining stars carved into his breastplate. In his hands he was holding a gargantuan sword, pointing it to the ground. However, the most striking thing about it was that the giant stone knight was missing his head. In fact, the roughly circular platform Sunny was standing on turned out to be the top of his neck. And by the looks of it, the head wasn't missing by design. It was as though something, or someone, had violently tore it off at some point in the distant past. Sunny walked around the platform, looking down from all sides, but didn't notice the head lying anywhere near. What on earth is this place? Without any hints to find the answer, he led his shadow back to the giant's neck and settled at the western edge of it, studying the feasting monsters. He didn't move until the sun was about to set. Just as Sunny expected, as soon as the sun touched the horizon, a deafening rumble could be heard coming from somewhere below. The monsters instantly stopped their feast and scurried away, some hiding inside the coral pillars, some simply burying themselves in the soft soil. A few minutes later, the first streams of black water appeared in the labyrinth. Their volume quickly grew, and soon an apocalyptic flood devoured everything around. The sea was returning with the approach of the night. Sunny stared at this unimaginable process, thoughts churning in his head. In an hour, the circular platform was the only thing above the dark waters once again. Chapter 32: Making a Choice. With an empty stomach and a head full of thoughts, Sunny returned to the center of the platform and sat down. After a while, he beckoned to his shadow and said, "Wake me up if anything happens." Then, he closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep. His consciousness quickly slid into the sweet embrace of darkness, giving Sunny some well-needed rest. In the middle of the night, however, a sudden impulse stirred him awake. Sunny jumped to his feet, his groggy mind full of tense apprehension. He was afraid that the owner of the giant tentacle had come back to finish the job. Or maybe some other horror from the depths had sensed him and decided to snack on human meat. However, the sea was quiet and calm. He didn't hear any abnormalities around the night statue. "What is it?" Sunny whispered, addressing the shadow. The shadow silently pointed him in a particular direction. Turning his head, Sunny squinted. He quickly understood why it was a good idea to wake up. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to see. Out there in the distance, a few kilometers away, a small orange light was shimmering in the darkness. Its reflections were rising and falling with the movement of waves. It was too far away to make out any details, so Sunny just stared at it for a while. Pretty soon, the light disappeared. Other sleepers? Natural phenomenon? Or some monster laying a trap? Memories of nightmarish deep-water creatures immediately came to his mind. Shaking his head, Sunny lay back down and attempted to return to his slumber. However, this time sleep was escaping him. Pangs of hunger were still not unbearable, but slowly becoming more and more intense. The thirst, however, was worse. In the end, he remained awake up until the sun rose again, sending the dark sea in retreat. As soon as the morning came, the pincer monsters crawled back from their hiding spots and rushed to the giant carcass to continue their feast. Sunny watched them for some time and then walked to the opposite side of the platform to take a look in the direction where he had seen the mysterious light the previous night. At a considerable distance from the headless statue, 5 or 6 kilometers away, the ground rose naturally and formed something akin to a hill. On top of that hill, an especially massive coral pillar rose to the sky. From the looks of it, its upper branches were just high enough to stay above water in the night. Various ideas stormed into Sunny's head, but at the end of it, only 2 questions were really important. First of all, would he be able to find the way through the labyrinth, and cover that distance during the day? And more importantly, should he even attempt to do it? After all, there was no indication that the source of the mysterious light was something beneficial, as opposed to dreadful and deadly. Not having enough information to make a choice, Sunny settled back to study the monsters. He did, however, send the shadow to investigate as far into the labyrinth as the range of shadow control allowed, hoping to chart at least the beginning of the path that could potentially lead him to that hill. Logically speaking, he was as safe atop the headless statue as he probably could be in this strange place. The only problem was, he was going to die soon because of thirst or hunger. Both problems were solvable if he were to venture down. He could desalinate the seawater in a number of ways taught to him by teacher Julius, with materials that were present pretty much everywhere in the dream realm. He could also prepare traps and hunt a pincer monster to eat. With their massive size, just one of them would be enough to feed him for weeks. He could easily see such a routine, hunting by day, returning to the statue at the approach of the night. It was probably his safest choice. However, this way of doing things lacked one vital element, the potential for improvement. It was well suited for keeping Sunny alive, but had no way of giving him hope. If he was destined to spend the rest of his life in the small area surrounding the headless statue, devouring monsters and trembling at night in fear of being devoured by something bigger in turn, well, he would rather just jump down and end it right now. That pretty much meant that the only choice left for him was to try and reach the source of the orange light. And if Sunny was really trying to attempt it, he had to do it before the pincer monsters were done consuming the giant carcass. That way, at least, the surrounding segment of the labyrinth was going to be free of them. Firm in his choice, Sunny decided to leave the headless statue the next morning. He would spend the rest of today exploring paths through the labyrinth and preparing himself mentally. With that, he closed his eyes and concentrated his perception on the moving shadow. In the night, a sudden storm descended upon the dark sea. Sunny was stirred awake by the shadow in time to prepare himself for the crushing winds and the pelting rain. Usually, rain always put him in a bad mood. But this time he was too thirsty to think about anything except for fresh water. Staying low so as to not be blown over the edge of the platform, Sunny cupped his hands and waited until they became filled with rainwater. Then he raised them to his mouth and greedily drank. Strikes of lightning illuminated everything above the churning sea. If anyone were to see Sunny now, they would have noticed a wide grin on his face. The storm continued to rampage for several hours. Sunny crouched in the middle of the platform, enduring its rage. More than once, a tall wave would crash into the headless knight's neck, threatening to wash him away. But Sunny held tight to the deep grooves in the stone surface of the platform, sticking to it like glue. By morning, when the storm finally dissipated, all of his muscles were sore. But there was no time to waste. As soon as the monsters came back to the carcass, with a few stragglers quickly following behind, he slid over the edge of the platform and began to nimbly climb down. Sunny had to thank wilderness survival classes once again, since he had been taught the basics of rock climbing as well. Teacher Julius was adamant about giving his student a crash course in all possible forms of traversal. Additionally, Sunny had already scouted the optimal way down and memorized the best holds and indentions to grab onto with the help of his shadow. Soon, his feet finally touched the ground. Despite the fact that leaving the safety of the headless statue was going to put him in considerable danger, Sunny instantly felt his mood improving. Remaining passive for the last couple of days did not suit his character well. Now, even if his plan were to end in failure, at least he was going to go down doing something that he had decided to do. Trying and failing was better than not trying at all. The black mud was deep enough to slow him down, but not to the extent he had been afraid of. With some practice, Sunny was soon able to walk at an acceptable speed. What's more, as long as he stuck to the shadows, his steps were light and silent, producing no squelching noises from the mud. He headed for one of the paths that were supposed to lead him to the distant hill and entered the cool shade of the crimson labyrinth. Immediately, a strange feeling enveloped his mind. It was as though the world beyond the labyrinth did not exist anymore, and all that was left were its twisting, dark paths. This thing almost seems endless. Shaking his head, Sunny sent the shadow to scout ahead, hoping to be notified of any latent danger in advance, and began to move forward. His life now depended on whether or not he would reach the distant hill before the sun began to set. He didn't even want to think about what would happen if he were still inside the labyrinth once the dark sea came back in an unstoppable flood. The shadow moved ahead of him, not meeting any hurdles. Sometimes it would climb high to scout the direction of different paths, allowing Sunny to choose the optimal route most of the time. However, he still had to backtrack a considerable distance once or twice, ending up either in a dead end or on a path leading in the wrong direction. Despite that, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Sunny even had time to carefully study the interior of the labyrinth, noticing more details of its composition, as well as a frightening amount of unrecognizable bones hiding in the mud beneath his feet. Because of how well things were going, he lowered his guard a little. His arrogance was also to blame. With his extensive preparations and skillful control of the Shadow Scout, Sunny subconsciously patted himself on the shoulder and assumed that everything was going to be fine. That's why, when the mud directly in front of him started to move, he was a fraction of a second late to react. In the next moment, a massive pincer shot out of the ground and tore through the air, threatening to cut his body in half with one crushing strike. Chapter 33 Carapace Scavenger. Crap! This was the only thought in Sunny's head as he awkwardly fell backward, allowing the pincer to close right in front of his face with a loud clack. The jagged, chitinous blades were so close that he could clearly see bits of mud sticking to their surface. Sunny landed on his back, narrowly avoiding the unexpected strike. The good thing was that he managed to avoid being injured or even killed. The bad thing was that he was sprawled on the ground, unable to quickly create distance between him and the attacker. The massive pincer was still hovering above. Just as this realization dawned on Sunny, he desperately rolled to the side. In the next moment, the pincer lunged down, sending small tremors through the mud. If not for his quick reaction, Sunny's chest would have been caved in by that blow. He was just beginning to stand up when the pincer swiped sideways. Luckily, Sunny was ready. Instead of trying to dodge or block the attack, he went with it, letting the pincer collide with his outstretched hands and cushioning the blow. As his arms screamed in pain, Sunny used the force of the blow and allowed his body to be sent flying through the air. This way, at least, he would get out of the pincer's range. He might not have been taught how to fight, but one thing he knew very well was how to fall. Instead of breaking his neck or having the breath beaten out of him by the landing, he braced his body and nimbly rolled before stopping some distance away from the ambushing monster. I take it back. Sunny, though, remembering his sarcastic critique of heroes' battle rolls. Rolling is an integral part of any respectable monster fighting technique. Then, he looked up, trying to ascertain the situation. In front of him, the attacker had finally shown itself. It burrowed from under the mud, casting a vast shadow over kneeling Sunny. Its tiny eyes were full of rage, hunger, and malice. It was one of the pincer monsters he had spent so much time observing. Towering over him at almost 3 meters in height, the bulky creature moved its mandibles and produced a jarring, piercing screech. "Why aren't you devouring the giant carcass with the rest of your buddies, you crab bastard?" However, the answer to Sunny's indignant plea was rather obvious. The monster seemed to be in a rather bad shape. Half of its 8 scythe-like legs were broken, and there were cracks in its thick carapace, each oozing with viscous azure blood. Additionally, he was missing one of its 2 pincer arms, which seemed to have been torn off entirely at the shoulder. If not for this pathetic state, the creature would have had no need to hide in the mud, hoping to catch easy prey. It could have just followed the other monsters and joined on the feast. Sunny was just unlucky to stumble directly upon its ambush. He had relied too much on the scouting abilities of his shadow, forgetting that it wasn't much more observant than an awakened human. It was also weightless and inaudible. That's why the monster did not react when the shadow had passed over its trap a minute earlier. On the other hand, Sunny could also consider himself lucky. By the same logic, he would not have been able to dodge the creature's sudden attack if not for its crippled, slowed state. But pondering on his luck could wait for later. Right now, Sunny had a far more pressing thing to do. Namely, try to survive. "Get back here!" he ordered the shadow and jumped to the side. In the next second, the space he occupied a moment before was torn apart by the attacking monster. Its heavy pincer crashed into the side of a coral pillar, sending crimson shards flying in every direction. Sunny caught his balance and continued moving. He was hoping that the bulky, heavily armored, wounded creature would not be able to match his speed, but unfortunately it turned out to be surprisingly agile. Its scythe-like legs pierced the mud behind him, and the pincer was already flying through the air again, threatening to decapitate the young man at any second. Sunny ducked, dodging the pincer, and finally caught a second of reprieve. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for something to use as a weapon. Almost instantly, he noticed a long, smooth, sharp bone left behind by some unknown creature sticking from the mud. Without slowing down, he bent down and grabbed the bone, pulling it out with one forceful tug. The bone was almost 1.5 meters long, ending in a narrow, sharp tip. It was almost like a spear. The problem was, even with the added length of this makeshift spear, Sunny's range of attack was still shorter than the monster's. He also doubted that it was capable of piercing the hard carapace. In short, he had to get close and aim for one of the cracks in the creature's armor. However, he didn't dare to. At that short of a distance, the monster could easily crush him into a paste by using just its weight and hulking frame. A crazy idea entered Sunny's mind. A bit shocked, he momentarily couldn't decide whether it was the product of audacity or foolishness. Either way, he wasn't insane enough to actually consider it. At that moment, the pincer lashed out again. This time, Sonny was a little late to evade, and as a result, a sharp pain pierced his left leg. It was grazed by the edge of the pincer. The puppeteer's shroud held, not allowing the monster to draw blood, but the force of the impact was enough to throw Sonny tumbling to the ground. There was no time to recover. As his eyes opened wide, Sonny understood that it was time to act crazy. So, instead of trying to dodge, he stopped moving and allowed the monster to grab him across his torso with the pincer. Immediately, a terrible pressure descended on his ribs. Sonny felt as though he was going to be split apart, but his armor, received from defeating an awakened tyrant, resisted the crushing bite of the monster's pincer. Every muscle in his body tensed, delaying the moment when his insides would be turned into mush. In the next second, Sonny's shadow fell from above, wrapping itself around the puppeteer's shroud. With the protective properties of the armor enhanced, he was able to better resist the pincer's pulverizing embrace. Sonny and the monster appeared to be at an impasse. The young man couldn't free himself from the monster's grip, while the monster could not kill the prey by cutting it in halves with its pincer. They stared at each other. Then, an insane fire ignited in the creature's eyes. It clicked its mandibles and raised Sonny in the air, bringing him closer to its mouth, obviously intent on biting his head off. "Why is everyone trying to eat me? Am I that tasty?" Sonny didn't struggle as the monster brought him close to its mandibles. He knew he only had one chance to live. In the last moment, Sonny allowed the shadow to flow from Puppeteer's shroud onto the sharp bone he was still clenching in his hand. Then, he gathered all his strength, leaned forward and thrust the bone forward with as much power as he could. Guided by his hand, the dark bone spear shot forward and pierced through the creature's tiny eye, sinking in deep. The other eye of the monster narrowed. Gritting his teeth from the unbearable pain in his ribs, Sonny twisted the bone, trying to do as much damage to the creature's brain as possible. For a couple of seconds, nothing happened. Then, he felt the pressure on his body diminishing. The pincer opened, letting Sonny fall down. As he hit the mood, the hulking monster crashed to the ground, too. The bone spear was still sticking from its head, bathed in the streams of azure liquid. Sonny moaned and drew in a raspy, painful breath. "You have slain an awakened beast, Carapace Scavenger. You have received a memory, Azure Blade. Your shadow grows stronger."